Record. So thank you for coming along to the launch of Act Local for Faster and Fairer Climate Action. Act Local is a new campaign, or really campaign toolkit that we have developed in order to give to you as local activists, that you can come together to take action, hold decision makers to account for faster and fairer climate justice in your constituency or local area. So I'm going to pass it over to Oisín to begin with, to talk about the inspiration of Act Local and where it sits in kind of the Friends of the Earth program. I'm then going to pass it over to Sive. Afterwards, we'll be talking about the two main strands that we are launching the campaign with. So those are Space for Nature, around biodiversity and the environment, and also connected communities, about public transport and active travel. And then we'll have space for questions. I'll talk through some of the resources that we're practically offering people and the next steps for getting more involved with the campaign. So it should take about an hour and a half, so we should be finished by 9 o'clock if all goes well. So, Oisín, are you happy to introduce?
Yes, sure. Hello, everybody. I can see your names in the list, so I recognize a good few of you, and welcome to those who haven't been on a webinar with us for a while. As many of you know, we used to do a lot of these during those times that would be nameless, but it's been a while since we haven't been on as much as we used to in post-COVID world. But it's very good to be with you tonight to talk about our latest campaign called Act Local for Faster and Fair Climate Action. And basically, those of you who've been part of the Friends of the Earth community for a few years will know we all spent a lot of time and effort on passing the climate law in 2021. And since then, which is amazing, an achievement by all of us. And since then, we've been kind of wondering exactly how best to, make sure that the binding commitments in the law and the ceilings that have now been passed by the oil on pollution for the 5-year periods from now to 2030, how best to make sure that they are actually respected, and that we actually begin to eliminate our emissions as fast as possible and as fairly as possible. And we know that will involve plenty of national campaigning that we all have been involved in over the years. And our national campaigns fall under the themes of climate, faster and fair climate action, gas and fossil fuels, getting off gas, and buildings and homes, and particularly the idea of warm homes for all. So tackling pollution from homes and energy poverty as well, particularly in the wake of the energy price dimension to the energy crisis over the last couple of years. So that's the general setup. We work on climate, on gas, and on heat and energy poverty. But we've been thinking, well, how do we get people more involved, and the members of the Friends of the community want to be more active, and where do we need to press most now, or where do we need to add pressure more than before in order to get decision makers to take climate action seriously, and to take it speedily, and to take it fairly? And our conclusion was, and has been, you'll have seen this in our communications over the last year or more now, is that we have to pivot not away from national, but pivot towards local as well, because local councils, other local decision makers, and even local TDs, local decision makers will play an increasingly important role now that we're in the phase of implementing climate policy on foot of the law, as opposed to just campaigning for a target or a law or an advisory committee. And so we've been preparing some resources to help supporters get active locally, join together locally, join forces, whether they are individuals who are coming together for the first time, or whether they're actually a pre-existing group, either an environmental group or some other group that wants to add a climate dimension to their work, given that climate is far more on the agenda than it was a few years ago, which is a real achievement. But now we need to see the action on the ground so that we actually begin to create less polluting, safer, cleaner, healthier communities and cities and country for ourselves over the years to come. So as Aaron has mentioned, and this will be got into more now by Sive, who's done some of the groundwork for us on this, we were thinking about what are the areas that can contribute to that big shift we need to make nationally, and the issues that also local decision makers have some real influence over, and that we think people will resonate with our own supporters, first of all, with the members of the Friends of the Earth community, with activists and campaigners, which is what we hope you all will be and are already, and with the general public, because a lot of this will be about talking to other members of the community about what can and may need to happen. And we know already that, there are, God help us, sort of flashpoints around Ireland where, often around parking spaces, and so I'm sure Cy will talk about this, where, short-term inconvenience or short-term disruption is being opposed by some section of the community because they see it as being disruptive for them, and they don't see the benefit that will accrue to the whole community if there's a safe route to school or a cycleway or a more walkable community. They just see the short-term risk to what they think is working for them right now. But we know that in order to have emissions by 2030 and get to zero as fast as possible, you may have heard me say this before in other places, there's no smooth path now. It's going to be disruptive, it's going to be inconvenient, but we know the alternative is far worse. It's the destruction and disaster of climate breakdown that we're seeing around the world. And we also know, and we know this from the research too, not just from our prior biases or our prior worldview, we know that actually once you make these changes around space for nature, around connected communities that you can get around with bicycles and cycling and walking and public transport, once you make those changes, everybody actually usually loves them, or most people love them. It's the change involved in getting there that's the challenge. So we want Act Local for Faster and Fair Climate Action is about enabling as many of the members of the Friends of the community as possible and beyond to be vocal and visible champions for brave and bold decision-making by decision makers locally for fair and faster climate action, if that isn't too long. But we need people to be vocal and visible for climate action, because at the moment, as we know, it's always people who, nationally as well as locally, those who see negative consequences in the short term are the ones who are most vocal and most organised. We need to be organised and vocal and visible. Now, and we'll talk about this briefly as well. I'll just say one more sentence. We have developed some resources, but they're very much, if you want, still in a work in progress. We're sharing them with you tonight. We will put them on our website in the coming days and share them with all our supporters. But we will improve them. They'll be a work in progress. We will improve them together as we all use them locally and learn from them, and we will make them more effective over time, and maybe add other issues. Sive's going to take you through two issues now. So this is the beginning of not just a single campaign, as in an issue around transport or nature. It is an additional way of campaigning for Friends of the Earth, because in this century, at least, Friends of the Earth has done very little locally focused campaigning. It's all been national. So this is the beginning of a new path for us, in addition to our other campaigning. And we expect to be on this path together for the next 5 or more years, until the end of the decade at least, while we forge that world of faster and fair climate action that is inclusive, that is diverse, that is building communities that actually will be more enjoyable and more livable and more healthy and clean at the end of it. But this is a first step tonight, and we've been talking about it for a while. We've mentioned it to you in emails and in another webinar, I think, back in the spring. But now we're getting practical, and we're looking forward to working on it and with it and through it with you on the challenges and opportunities ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Oisin. That's been a really great explanation as to motivation and idea behind Act Local. And I think you really laid out why acting locally is important and the things we can do to really push for implementation of those national level targets and mandates. I'm just going to pass over the side, and we're going to talk about the two kind of campaign strands that we have, which are space for nature and connected communities, and what it means to act locally on those, why they're important, and how we can take a stand in our local communities.
Thanks, Aaron, and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people joining us this evening. As Oisín said, we have achieved a lot in our campaigning at a national level. We've secured a very strong climate law and various changes in government policy that are going to be critical for achieving our climate goals and for any chance of us to do our fair share of what's required under the Paris Agreement. But Ireland is already, and the world is also, suffering a biodiversity crisis. And in fact, the biodiversity crisis is every bit as serious as the climate crisis. Maybe, Aaron, you might move on there. So globally speaking, we know that biodiversity decline and extinction rates have been accelerating. A sixth mass extinction has already been declared by some scientists who are noting that up to 1 million species could go extinct over the next few decades. And in Ireland, biodiversity decline is also a serious problem. And the EPA have studied this extensively, as have the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And they report that habitat destruction, the intensification of fishing, forestry and agriculture, loss of peat bogs, urbanization, which is a kind of land use change, covering over the land essentially with buildings and roads and asphalt and so on, and increased use of pesticides and chemicals are all impacting on the ability of species to thrive and the ability for ecosystems to function properly. When it comes to protected areas under the EU Habitats and Birds directives, Ireland is actually close to the bottom in terms of the amount of area that's been designated. We're the fourth from the bottom. And this just illustrates that there's been an historical lack of attention to taking care of protected areas. In addition to that, these protected areas for birds and special habitats are actually in very poor condition. Over 85% of them are regarded as in an unfavourable condition, and 40% are in a serious condition. So these are areas that have already been set aside for protection, and due to the lack of enforcement and lack of management plans, they are deteriorating instead of doing their work in protecting those areas for those important species. Can you go on there, Aaron? So one of the reasons that we chose Space for Nature as a campaign theme, given that it hasn't been a particularly strong focus of Friends of the Earth's work in relation to climate, is that it's quite obvious that at a local level, decision-making really matters if we're going to do anything about the biodiversity crisis. For one thing, if biodiversity protection and enhancement is a policy priority of local decision makers, particularly local authorities, they can make a very big and significant difference, both in terms of planning policy and in the way they carry out their other functions. It's also quite clear that given that agriculture is the single largest driver of water pollution, biodiversity loss, ammonia emissions, and also greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland, that we have to find ways at every level, both at national level, local level, and in our households, to shift away from animal agriculture and diets that have lots of meat in them, and to think about managing land in ways that leave space for nature and also shifts us towards a different conception of agriculture that is less impactful on the environment in all of those ways. But certainly the role of agriculture and farming and farmland in providing space for nature is absolutely critical, because even at the moment, farmland is a very important habitat for certain species of birds and wildlife, but also the networks of hedgerows and riparian zones around rivers are very, very important habitats anyway, and they need to be protected, and very often that's on farmland. In addition, local authorities are empowered to enforce many of the critical environmental laws that really matter for biodiversity, including legislation on air pollution, water pollution, and they have a role in inspecting farms to ensure that they're not in breach of their waste management and water guidelines. Urban and suburban areas, of course, are not exempt from any of this. So the solutions are not just about, doing things differently on farmland or, growing new forests, for example, but urban and suburban areas should and can make space for nature corridors. There shouldn't be such a strong distinction in a way between urban and rural areas. Countryside should be allowed to come into the city. We should have more parks, more green spaces, more connectivity of habitats. And also we need to rethink how we use and manage and landscape green spaces, and even our own gardens if we're lucky enough to have one. And as part of all of that, if we're going to succeed in protecting biodiversity, we need some legal changes. The Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss called for a right to a clean environment and also rights for nature to be included in the Constitution. And only today, a team of lawyers was before the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate and the Environment advocating for this. So hopefully it's something that over time we can build much more of a campaign on. It hasn't been a kind of focal point for environmental campaigning. But this is an opportunity because we can see the effect of litigation on climate policy, and there's no reason to think it can't have the same effect in mobilizing public opinion and shaping political opinion on biodiversity as well. Aaron? So what can we actually do about it at a local level? Well, in terms of thinking about local authorities in particular, it's very important that we consider the fact that the housing for all, and just generally speaking, development of any kind that changes land use from green space, open space, or agriculture into development of some sort represents a loss to biodiversity. So a key principle, and it's not just for here in Ireland, this is a global principle that's been incorporated in many, many frameworks now, including new kind of corporate responsibility reporting guidelines, is that all development must provide a net gain to biodiversity. And that means that the first principle is you avoid doing any damage, you try to mitigate it if possible, and if not, compensate. So if there are losses of trees and green space and so on, you must replace that, and you must replace it like for like. So you're looking for mature greenery, if you like, to replace mature greenery. Now, this is not ideal because you lose the species because they have to get away from development. But when we're thinking about all of the housing construction that has to take place in Ireland, this is a really important principle. And if it were incorporated into every architectural proposal, every development plan, and all the decisions that come from decision makers like on Board Panola and the state agencies as they're planning things, this would make a significant difference to what would otherwise happen. In terms of local authorities as well, they have a very important role to play in providing tree planting, parks, very small parks and green areas, landscaped areas, playgrounds, and I'm calling them pocket forests, but this is actually a project by a number of people to promote kind of micro forestry, micro areas of woodland that are completely replicable in almost any community. There's a little patch of land that could be devoted to carefully chosen tree planting. But the idea is that we need to try and avoid as many hard surfaces appearing as possible, and avoid a waste of space by turning it into a kind of a bland kind of mono landscaping. We've seen it all over the place when there's so much potential for growing native trees and shrubs that actually support wildlife. In terms of community activity, there's just so many things already happening, so many things we can do. There's community gardening, community orchards, composting, guerrilla gardening, and which is where you kind of take over a site that you don't even own. And of course, there are many projects where local communities have banded together to take care of abandoned or deteriorating woodlands and also local bogs. That photograph there on the left, I think, is really fantastic because that's a site that doesn't look terribly promising. It's right beside the motorway. I think it's right beside the M50 or something like that. Not the M50, but a big road. And they've taken over that site in South County Dublin to plant a community orchard. And I think it's important to see it in that condition because those sites don't look like anything that you can do anything with for biodiversity, but that's exactly what they're doing. And they won a big Tidy Towns Biodiversity Award. Can you go on again, Aaron? So where do you come in? And of course, we don't want you to feel that this is a burden on you as individuals, but we're just trying to give you resources that you can use at any scale to kind of participate in this campaign. There is absolutely thousands of actions that we can take, and biodiversity protection is one that you can do very much as an individual, actually, with a few plants or a few herbs in your windowsill. The main thing, though, is not to be an individual. The more you join up with other people, the more effective your voice will be, and the easier it will be to be heard. Community gardening and those kind of allotment projects have a really impactful way on people in terms of collaborating together on a community basis, growing food, swapping, sharing their produce. And it's important that we lean on local authorities, especially coming up to local elections, to provide more allotments, community gardens, and basically spaces that can be given over to the community for various biodiversity projects. The All Ireland Pollinator Plan is a really important initiative because, again, it's steps that you can take are extremely simple, and they can be done in your own garden. They can be done on a grass verge outside on your street. They can be done even in an apartment complex, or they can be done on a much larger scale by local authorities. So the principal idea is to try not to mow grass in May, which is the chief time when dandelions come into flower particularly, and it's an important source of food for insects as they come out of hibernation, particularly bees. So you can see there that there is a big, beautiful meadow there. And the key thing is not to use any imported seed. We have to use native seed, otherwise it can be contaminated with invasive species. Another thing you can do, and I was involved in a project like this myself way, way back in the 1990s, is a community composting scheme. But even if you don't have a community composting scheme, you can make your own quite easily and try to avoid chemicals like glyphosate. Some local authorities have now agreed to ban the use or phase out the use of glyphosate for everything except treating invasive species like Japanese knotweed. And it is something that a lot of people feel very passionately about. So that could be something your community could come together around, write to your councillors, try to get the local authority to pass a motion because its own use of glyphosate could be halted, whatever about having a wider impact. And finally, there are absolutely dozens of organizations at a local level that you can get involved in. And the Tidy Towns has really shifted in recent years away from just sort of cosmetic tree planting. And they have to do a lot of things under the award scheme now to attend to biodiversity issues. And some of the biodiversity projects that I've seen under the Tidy Towns are really fantastic examples of what anybody could be doing at a local level. But in addition, there are lots of groups at local level that wouldn't necessarily be well known at a national level. And many of the national groups like the Irish Wildlife Trust, Birdwatch and An Taisce have local branches that you can join, get involved in going on walks or just getting involved in local campaigning so that you don't have to feel in any sense that you're alone. So the next theme that we wanted to have a look at is what we call connected communities. And this is where we're thinking about sustainable mobility, how we get around essentially. It's quite clear that we have made significant traction at a national level in driving a big change in transport policy. Under the programme for government, the government now must invest 2 to 1 in a 2 to 1 ratio towards public transport over roads. And there's a big fund available for active travel. But all of that money is no good if the projects can't get completed at a local level. And also we need to pretty much shift away from a car dependent paradigm that's been dominating our towns, our cities, our villages, our suburbs. And that's going to require engagement and involvement at every level. We also have a really serious road safety issue that is becoming quite obvious. So when we think about climate action at a local level, we have to think about that paradigm shift that we're trying to get away from this car dependent model towards shared mobility, which is some form of public transport, various different types, and of course active travel, cycling and walking or scooting. And all of these things obviously reduce emissions because they reduce our reliance on cars, but they also have considerable health benefits. And they also demand changes at a local level into how space is allocated on our streets and our roads, and how new areas and communities are designed. We've noted from some research that Rosie Leonard, who's on maternity leave now with Friends of the Earth, that forced car ownership is a really big problem in rural areas. People are forced to drive everywhere because they have no options. And there are interesting, demographics that are particularly affected. She found that university students from low-income families particularly are forced to drive long distances in order to get to college because they can't afford university accommodation. So forced car ownership and transport policy generally has a very important equity impact. So if we want a climate just solution for transport, we have to be factoring in the needs of all users, regardless of their age and ability and so on. So what are the solutions? Well, these are just kind of key principles. We need to put sustainable accessibility at the forefront. Now, that might sound obvious, but a lot of transport investment prioritizes fast journey times over sustainable accessibility. So the decision making is lopsided in favor of roads, essentially, especially for longer distances. And speed should not be the guiding factor. Sustainable accessibility, getting where you need to go in a sustainable mode. In particular, we need to prioritize the interests of children. So if children can't cycle or walk safely to school, if they can't access school transport, not only is their family disadvantaged and there's extra cost, but they don't get the benefits of the exercise and getting themselves to school. They don't get to learn independence. And you also end up with a huge amount of congestion. So we need to prioritize, getting children to school safely by school transport and safe routes, cycling and walking, and school streets where necessary. It goes without saying that Friends of the Earth wants to see public transport prioritised over all car-centric development, and that is going to be a critical factor in the rollout of the new housing construction planned under Housing for All. We're still seeing some quite poor quality designs and layouts coming through that are going to involve carbon lock-in if it requires people to drive. We need to see a total mindset change around providing transport in rural communities. There is a perception that you need to have high density communities and development in order to justify investing in public transport, but that's not necessarily the case. If we're going to address car dependency in an equitable way, we need to provide frequent, reliable and integrated public transport services in all rural areas. Joined up services so that buses and local links connect with trains and that timetabling is integrated. And finally, we need to consider, as I said, the need for all road users and demographics. One of the things that I learned researching this is the particular challenges that people with disabilities have in accessing public transport. Sometimes they have to give a day's notice in order to access a bus, and this is not on, but for privately provided bus services, there's no requirement to provide wheelchair access until 2026. And this is simply not on. That's outrageous and inequitable. Can you move on again, Aaron? So where do you come in? Well, the main thing is that we are blessed in Ireland to have a fantastic array of local groups that have been campaigning on active travel. There are cycling groups all over the country and in rural areas as well. They're not all just in towns and cities. And there's many other groups that you can get involved with. For example, there's one campaign group, Love 30, that campaigns for local lower speed limits. And of course, through groups like An Taisce, you can pay more attention and get involved in monitoring the planning process to make sure that you can see what's being proposed by the local authority in terms of its Part 8 or Section 38 proposals around traffic calming or active travel measures. Never underestimate the power of your voice if you're in support of something. Very often, proposals by the local authority, there's a lot of good proposals coming from them now because they have the budgets, they have active travel teams, and they have to be proposing networks of cycling and walking routes in towns and cities. but these sometimes run into problems because the only people who comment on them are objectors. So it's important to show your support for cycleways, even if it isn't coming outside your road, your door, and it isn't something you're going to use. Just signal your support, and it just tends to shift the balance of public opinion overall, because those comments and submissions are what councillors read when they're making final decisions. So support lower speed limits, traffic calming proposals, and all sustainable transport. And I appreciate there are some difficulties in the detail. Not all the bus connect services and cycle lanes are perfectly designed. But the thing is to engage with the process in a kind of supportive way, recognizing that we have to make this change to sustainable mobility, because the current paradigm isn't working for anybody. I mean, even if you're lucky enough to own a beautiful, big, shiny SUV, you still have to put up with congestion because there are far too many cars on the road. And Aaron has designed some resources that you can use to including some media guidelines and also a petition guideline. So one thing you can do is organise a petition to the local authority calling, or the National Transport Authority actually, to demand sort of changes to certain bus routes or whatever they're proposing, if you have better ideas than they do. And our briefings have a lot more information for you on all of those topics. Happy to answer any questions again later as well. So thank you, Aaron, and I'm back over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sive. So I know that was a lot of information there, everyone. So I suppose what we're going to look at next is how do we go kind of from that policy and those like big picture ideas to what are the things that you actually need to go and take them and campaign on them in your local area. So we're going to be looking at the Act Local toolkit, and then there'll be space after that for questions and discussion. So thinking about this as a toolkit or as sort of a series of steps as to how to get active in your community. So we know that, you know, there's lots of kind of levels of activity. You know, some people might be an individual, they might not know where to start. Some people might be part of a tidy towns group. Some people might be part of, you know, another group that's been active for a while. So there's lots of levels of engagement and lots of avenues to get involved. So in terms of like how to act local, this is kind of a brief, you know, step-by-step guide as to, you know, if you don't know where to start, this is somewhere you can begin. And this is how you can progress up to actually getting involved in the real world, doing things for faster and fair climate action, putting pressure on decision makers in your local area. So thinking about this, the first place that you could potentially start is a Cuppa for Climate. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a minute, but this is one of our kind of current avenues for getting involved to meet people in your area who also share a concern about the climate. You know, if you know other people, or if that goes successfully, you can decide on what your campaign campaign is. So that can be taking some of the ideas I've mentioned before. You know, there's a whole, as you can see, those even two very specific topics open a wide range of possibilities that can, you know, depending on what matters to you in your local area, you could focus on biodiversity and making sure that there's, you know, adequate biodiversity protections for new developments. Or if you think that's not as big of an issue and you'd really like to see more cycle lanes or more public transport, that can be what you focus on. So it's really about tailoring it to what you think will have the greatest sway for your community, and that has the greatest need and that affects the most people, and that can actually, you know, make some difference. From there, you can look at our campaigning guide, which I'll also talk about in a moment, on how to assemble a campaign, the nuts and bolts of it, and push for that sort of local change. There's a guide on doing a press release. And for example, you could use that press release to launch your campaign that, you know, 15 people in, you know, Mayo have gotten together and have decided to take action for climate under this Act Local banner. And this is how they're going to do it. And lastly, the most important thing is just getting out and organizing. You know, change isn't going to be made just from, you know, talking to people we already agree with, or, you know, staying online in our bubbles. We need to actually get out and, you know, change minds. And we need to talk to the decision makers and the people in power. and we need to try and bring them onto our side and explain to them why they need to take action for climate. So, step by step for all that stuff. The Cover for Climate. Now, this is something that we've launched in the last few months. Well, about the last year. People here might be familiar with it already. Some people might have run it already. And it's essentially a set of guidelines and questions on how to host a kind of coffee morning or afternoon to talk about climate. So it's about getting people together, maybe people that have never talked about this kind of thing before, people that are maybe experiencing climate anxiety and don't know where to start, and address some of those issues of hopelessness. And, you know, bringing people together can be the first step in taking action to be an antidote to that sort of anxiety. So the Cover for Climate website, Cover for Climate resources have been on the website for a while, but they're attached as part of the Act Local toolkit as well. And with this, you know, you can bring people together, start talking about issues, which is the first step of making any sort of change, and, you know, make that sort of public presence for climate action in your locality known. The other resources we've put together are the 2 briefings that Sive mentioned. So they go far more in depth than what we cover in the slides, going through, you know, the background, the statistics, the facts, who's responsible for certain decisions that can be targeted to, you know, put pressure on them to make climate friendly decisions, and, you know, what the solutions or what the demands are that you can bring regarding that. And there's a full campaigns guide covering the nuts and bolts from the basics of how to manage a group to winning on your issues. So examples of action planning, you know, publicity, getting out and talking to people, how to do all of that in kind of a step-by-step manner. And bonus guides specifically for press releases and local petitioning. So, you know, it's very important that we get out there and get our names in the media and get our ideas out in the public as well. So, you know, petitions are a great way to do that. They're a great way to show public support behind an issue, and they're a great excuse to get to talk to people on the street, on doors, in communities, you know, in community centers, wherever, and get them to your side, get more numbers behind the cause. And that's how we're going to, you know, make a change to our decision makers. And so what else is really Act Local offering? So we're taking these resources, we're giving them to you. We've given, you know, some examples as to what you might want to do with them, what kind of campaign themes to organize around. But really, that's just the beginning. So, you know, you might decide, yeah, these ideas seem good. I'm interested in public transport, or I'm interested in biodiversity, but maybe I really want to get active on, you know, pollution in my area, or I really want to get active on some other issue. The toolkit is adaptable, so you can take those and you can get active on climate in a way that you see fit in your area. These are just guidelines or suggestions as to how to get things started. Really, Act Local is the network of groups that are signing up to take this sort of action for fast and fair climate action in their locality. So long as you are signing up to be a part of that group, to you know, make that stand as locals in your area, then you're a part of the Act Local network. As part of this, we're also offering monthly check-ins for people using the toolkit so that they can share their experiences, share suggestions, and build stronger relationships. So, you know, I think what's often happening is there's lots of great work that's happening across the country, but it can be kind of localized, and somebody in a town over here might not know about the work that's happening, you know, across the country, or, you know, even down the road. And that what we want to do is basically facilitate groups coming together so that they can share, you know, what has worked, what hasn't, how can we learn from each other's experiences and grow and develop our campaign, and how can we build that sense of connection and solidarity so that people really feel linked in together. And how can we, you know, workshop stuff if we're finding it difficult to make ground with a particular campaign? Maybe somebody has a suggestion as to how to best approach that. That's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a network of people supporting and looking out for each other through the campaign. And really, you know, where it goes is it's going to be led by you. So the Act Local campaign, it's you and your community coming together. And as Friends of the Earth, we aim to facilitate that and help it develop in the best way that we can. So we're planning for more events, more trainings in the new year, but really it's your suggestions that will help guide where this goes. Do you want media training? Do you want action training? What kind of things would you like to see? And what other strands of the campaign would you like to see as well? So like we said, we focused on biodiversity and public and transport and active travel, but maybe you feel that a really big thing that's happening in your area is data centers using up a large amount of electricity capacity, or gas generation. There's potentially fossil fuel infrastructure going in. These are things that we're reliant on your input and your suggestions as to things that maybe you would like to see happening. So there will be more strands that are developed for the campaign as time goes and as it builds, but really it's your campaign to take and play with. So with that in mind, there's a couple of things about how do you actually get involved, and I'll share these in the chat. So the first one is we have a type form. So I know everyone here, so we have a type form if you want to get further involved. Sorry, these should be the other way around actually, sorry. First thing you should do is fill out the registration page on the website. So this is what everyone will be filling in to get involved with Act Local, and that will sign you up to the mailing list to find out about what events are happening, what activities, what other groups are up to, and when the sort of extra support sessions are happening to help you with your campaigning. Secondly, we also have a type form just for capturing further information. This is just to get from people, if you are in a group, what is that group? If your group is signing up to the campaign, or if you're an individual and you want to find a group or help form a group, this is so we can tailor that to you. We can put people in contact with what groups are active in their locality, or log what's been happening with groups across the country. We've other plans in the new year as well. So we're potentially, we're planning on kind of getting a map, so a visual display as to what's happening, so people can look and see, very clearly what is happening across their local areas for climate action, and how this has grown across the country, so that people really aren't on their own. So I'm just going to share those links with you in the chat quickly. So 1 second. So there is the sign up link for the general mailing list, and here is the type form for getting involved. And the type form will also be going out, and the other link will also be going out in the follow-up email to this event. So if you don't get them down now, don't worry, but they're in the chat if you want to get a head start and signed up. And just before we go any further, I thought now might be a good time to open the floor a little bit for you. So you've heard a lot of us talking, and we don't want to sit here and pretend that we're the experts on what the issues are in your area or the ways that you can most effectively use them. So we're going to open it up for about 15 minutes on these two questions. So if you want to come in on this, there's two ways you can do it. One is you can put up your hand. So I see two participants have raised their hand already, and we can bring you in to speak on it. And two is, the second way is you can answer in the Q&A if you would like to type it instead. And so the questions are, so are you involved campaigning on any of these issues already, or part of a group that could get active? So just trying to read the room as to, what people's level of activity already is. Do they think that they can take these resources as is and use them in an existing group, or are they more interested in starting at the ground level and helping form a group from the grassroots? Or, what more do you need? So like, what specific trainings do you think you'd need, or what kind of resources would you like to see be developed in the future for this to be of most use to you? So like I said, it's your campaign. We're here to facilitate and help develop it, but we want to be led by you as to what you think is most useful. So I'm going to start by looking at the people that have their hands up there. So I see James, you have your hand up, so I'm going to bring you in if you'd like to.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, works perfect.
Yeah, hi, I'm James Ryan from Climate Action Lewisburg locality down in southwest Mayo. And I suppose we're quite an advanced group. We've been established for over 2 years, and we're dedicated entirely to climate action and biodiversity enhancement. There's about 11 of us in the group, and we really are very active. We're planting trees, we're encouraging PV panels, retrofitting, and doing work on the local rivers as well. We find ourselves actually almost doing everything, because what we're talking about involves doing everything, really. So the issue that I'm trying to address as I talk now is that the central government has tasked local authorities with implementation of the climate action laws locally. Now, we have a population of 130,000 people in Mayo, roughly, and we have 2 staff in Mayo County Council who are dedicated to climate action. They are completely overwhelmed. They have the funding, and all the local authorities do, to appoint a biodiversity officer, but the biodiversity officer has not been appointed, and I think this applies to a lot of other local authorities as well. So there's an extra resource they could have that they're not using. I think that local groups are actually key to successful implementation of the climate action policies, and it really needs to get down to a granular level. You know, in our area we have 1,500 households. We have ambitions to install at least 500 PV houses in our area, so that's a third by 2030. We want to plant hundreds of acres of trees. These are huge tasks, and already many of us here, volunteers, are already doing 2 or 3 days work a week, running different strategies that we have. What we are finding, I know this is more advanced than maybe this meeting has been addressing, so I'm speaking from the perspective of a fairly advanced group. We've got to the stage of feeling a little bit overwhelmed by what we're trying to do. We've come to the conclusion that we actually need a local office, that we actually need staff in that office who are dedicated to climate action, and that we who are now volunteers would actually become a board of directors running this climate office. I know this sounds outrageous, but the task before us is enormous, and that's what I'm trying to address here. You know, we're talking about saving civilization as we know it, and the government has drawn up fairly good climate action policies and strategies and laws, but implementation is failing because they haven't recognized what's needed on the ground. That's kind of the point I want to make. Thank you.
I might come in, Aaron, if that's okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, James.
I'm sure many of my colleagues, James, would have lots to discuss with you, and it's fantastic to hear about all the work that your group has been doing. But I do understand completely the scale of what you're trying to do compared to the resources and the support you're getting. So part of the point of this particular campaign, Act Local, is to build a grassroots movement so that it's not foisting all these tasks on groups like yours that are already doing it and are already like totally doing everything that we've been talking about. It's about how to build that awareness and sense of collective action and urgency amongst a wider community, and including groups that are already out there but who aren't working on biodiversity and climate action and don't really know where to start. So and for groups like yours, I think it's particularly important that you don't take on more than a group of 11 people can actually handle, because if you fizzle out and disappear, that will be a tragedy. So it might be an interesting one to discuss with us in terms of, you know, talking about how you grow in the next phase of your work, how you build more support, connections and networks with other groups in Mayo, and also how you use your expertise and influence lobbying instead of just, well, sorry, not instead of, but lobbying as well as acting. So how influential can you be in a smart way by using sort of the resources that we have developed to lobby TDs and get more people to support your demands, to try to share the workload and at the same time be even more effective than you clearly already are. But I mean, I'd love to talk to you about that, all of that in more detail. And it's something that we're very exercised by. Many of us are activists in our local communities as well. And it's really easy to feel that you have to take on everything and that nobody else in the community cares except you. But actually, sometimes there are social tipping points that if you just get involved in the right campaign, the right messaging, the right kind of public demonstrations and activities, eventually more and more people join in, and all of a sudden you have a tipping point and you have a kind of more of a sense of that it's the majority opinion. Now, we might be some distance from that, but that's what this campaign is all about.
I'm seeing the questions coming in through the chat, which are great, and we're going to be getting to those shortly. One thing I just noticed already, though, is Neve was actually saying she's based in Southwest Mayo too, and is interested in getting involved in a local level. So it's great that we're already being able to facilitate these conversations between, you know, people in the same area who might not have actually been aware of each other's work, but want to start doing stuff together. So, you know, that's why it'd be great if you could, you know, fill in the sign-up forms and we can actually start going on this sort of stuff. But there was another person who I saw had raised their hand who I was going to bring in. So Eleanor, do you want to come in on those 2 points I have on the screen there? Hello. I can't hear you, Eleanor, but you're unmuted. Okay, I might come back to you, Eleanor, if you get your audio set up okay. But I see there's someone else with their hand up there.
Claire,
Claire?
can you bring it, Claire?
Yeah. Hello. Um, can anyone hear Claire?
No, I'm not hearing Claire.
Okay. Seems to be some issues with some audio there, folks. Okay, maybe we can come back to you and look at some of the questions or comments in the chat. So there is a question here from Bob Wilson at the top. So the question was, can a local landscape partnerships group be started maybe under the IENs, the Irish Environmental Network, or the Environmental Pillar? I suggested this, but not getting any answers. Does anyone want to come in on that?
I mean, I could only give an answer in general principle, like because I was actually wondering, Messiah may know more. I was only going to be interesting to ask Bob to say a few words about what a local landscape partnership is, to see if it's something that could be that other groups might want to push for locally. I can only talk procedurally about what the national network of environmental NGOs that he's referring to may or may not do, or who he should talk to. But it might be interesting to hear a little bit more about is this a kind of thing that people could be pushing for in lots of areas. Is Bob still? Yeah, Bob is here. Bob, would you want to see if we can spotlight Bob there and see if he can find his volume button?
Yes, I will do that. So, Bob, if you're there, and we're interested in contributing.
Hello.
Hi.
Bob
Hi, Bob.
here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You can hear me.
We can, yes. Fire ahead.
Okay, yes. The local landscape partnership idea. It's happening in UK, and there are 3 or 4 landscape Northern Ireland, and people kind of define what is our local landscape or cityscape or townscape or whatever, seascape, and then develop a partnership with all relevant people in that area, so that they can do the Cuppa for Climate and all that kind of thing between them. But it's a way of it's stronger than just a loose network. People feel they become part of a local partnership. They get to know each other, they get to understand what each other's doing, and they work better together. And they have strength from the partnership. The partnership can then go to government and say, look, we are a partnership of 20 or 30 whatever groups and individuals in this area, and we the local people want this whatever to happen for our area. So
And Bob,
that's
can
what
I
it's
ask a
about.
question?
Hello?
Can I ask a question, Bob?
Yeah, sure.
Do they have some status conferred from somewhere other than just what they take for themselves, as in by calling themselves a local landscape partnership, as opposed to calling themselves an Act Local group or a Friends of the Earth group or a climate action group? Does that give them, at least in in other jurisdictions, some particular status that means that they get resources?
Well, I guess the status.
Are they have to be listened to, or they have to be engaged with?
They seem to get recognition. Well, in UK anyway, and Northern Ireland, they've got strong recognition, and each one of the local landscape partnerships got over $1 million funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund. Now, we don't have that fund here, but there are other funding sources available if we can put over the message. I suggest people have a look at there's a local landscape partnership for Lough Erne area, and that might be a good one to link with and find out more about. And then there's the Belfast Hills landscape partnership.
It sounds, if I might come in
there are several others. Sorry.
It's a little bit like the model of the Uplands Forum and also the river trusts. The idea is that,
Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying. Volume is very poor.
I think it might be your internet, Bob. You were quite wobbly in some of your audio. But let's answer for everybody else as well.
I was just saying, Bob, I think it's a really interesting initiative. And it seems to work on a similar model to the Uplands Forum and also the river trusts. And in the briefing that we've prepared on Space for Nature, we have covered those as kind of multi-stakeholder sort of structures that are worth exploring. It tends to vary a lot from place to place. Like there's about 4 or 5 river trusts in Ireland, in the Republic. There are lots more in the UK and Northern Ireland, but it depends on where the local energy is. And this comes back to a question actually that Claire Romito has put, an interesting one. Claire is living in a rural area and is a bit nervous about campaigning on, anything to do with climate when she's surrounded by dairy and beef farmers that may not be particularly receptive, and that there might be some resistance to it. So when you're in, you know your community best, and you know where the potential levers are. Going head to head with the farming community when you're just one person is going to be a bit stressful. I agree, but there are sometimes issues where there's a striking opportunity for consensus and agreement, and one of them is the pollinator plan. So there is huge participation by farmers in the pollinator plan, and there's also a huge amount of interest in sort of expanding the work of local authorities and community groups to the agricultural sector around pollinators. So that might be one way of kind of getting around the resistance. You're not hitting the climate tricky stuff head on, you're getting around it. And sometimes the biodiversity projects can be a really wonderful way for communities to come together in a much less contentious and fraught way than fighting about climate change and the science and all of the stuff about livestock. So the other thing I was going to answer was just a question that came up, or a couple of comments came up about climate action plans. I didn't stress that in detail at all, but at the moment, many of the local authorities have draft climate action plans out for consultation. And this is an ideal opportunity to make suggestions, as people were saying there, about community gardens, allotments, active travel, all of the different ideas you have. So check them out. I have had a brief look at the one published by Dublin City Council, and it looks really excellent in terms of its thinking and framework. But of course, it will always come down to implementation and resources. And the councillors have to vote on it at the end. They have to adopt the plan. So there's always the possibility that things could get watered down. So it's really important that we try to build on the momentum and use the council resources and the teams that are preparing these good plans and make sure that they get adopted.
Good stuff. There's a couple questions that have been kind of answered, but I'd like to just comment on, which is that there's been a number of people in the chat talking about how the Catholic Church, they're committed to giving over 30% of parish grounds to biodiversity by 2030. So that's like another potential avenue to advocate on, or to push to make sure it's actually implemented. And that's one that's very, achievable and very locally based as well. So yeah, that's another place that we could go. I see Anna Murphy, you have your hand up. So I'm going to bring you in to talk if you have a question or a comment on these.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just very interested in the farming versus environmental thinking. And I live in rural Ireland too. And funnily enough, we're in a sustainable energy community, and Lewisburg Climate Action Group were on a call that I was on as well. And I live in Kinvara. So the Lewisburg community, there was a farmer speaking, and he was a traditional small farmer, and the man who spoke earlier probably knows him. But they've made huge advances there, and I actually would love to get talking to him separately, because they've a group of 15 organic farmers there now, and they seem to be very much around space for nature and not what the stereotype that we sometimes expect. I just wanted to make that point. We have to be careful in how we look at the farming community or how we portray them or whatever.
So if you look like you want to come in on that.
I agree. I think that the way shall we call it, the discourse has been unfolding in recent years has been very difficult and confrontational. I've been involved with a number of the campaigns ongoing around the nature restoration law and various other things in the media over the last couple of years, and the climate action plan and the sectoral emission ceilings. And I just want to make the point that, the environmental groups and the climate action groups have really been, pushing for policy coherence at a national level. But when farmers hear us, they think we're talking about them individually, and they take great offense at some of the kind of scientific, abstract, formal language that's used. They're quite connected to their communities, their land, and they perceive the situation in a very different way. They see the opportunities and the costs in a very different way to the way that farmers do. But I will say that many of my colleagues across the different NGOs have gone to great lengths to reach out to farmers and farming communities and to try to bypass the large organizations that claim to speak for all farmers but clearly don't. And on the ground, you find a huge variety of opinions and perspectives and expertise, and a huge level of interest among farmers in supporting climate action and biodiversity action. It's a lot more polarized within the farming community, but one of the things that the surveys and opinion polls have shown in recent years is that there is broad support across urban and rural communities for climate action and quite specific policies. So that, I think we're often a little bit too timid and too shy. I read a post today from the director of the National Biodiversity Data Centre, who was talking about him being attacked by people who just didn't want to hear about the biodiversity crisis. So he was saying in the post how important it was to speak the truth, even if it's inconvenient, because there's so much at stake. When we have to find ways of communicating it carefully and not to offend people and not to make people feel like they're being attacked. But the truth is that we are in a climate and biodiversity emergency, and we need to come together to address it.
And I'll come in on that briefly too, and then I know there's other questions we want to get to in the remaining time. But Sai mentioned the polling that shows there's no real urban-rural divide on awareness about the threat from climate, or on concern and desire for action. There are some differences about how accessible people feel the solutions are for them. So if you're in a rural area, depending on your car to get anywhere, you feel that more than if you're in an urban area where you can get a bus or a dart, for example. But even among farmers, there was some interesting information in an Irish Times poll recently, where in the general public, 18% of the public said that climate change should be a top priority for government. And the figure among farmers who said that was exactly the same. So there wasn't a lower number among farmers. What was different, though, was that the number of people who said it shouldn't be a priority at all for government, that percentage was higher among farmers than among the general public. So if anything, the polarization is happening within the farming community, as opposed to between the farming community and the rest of society, or urban and rural. And that's not very surprising, given the amount of, for want of a better word, misinformation that farming groups are subjected to by people on social media, by sometimes their own leaders, and to some degree by the government themselves, who have kept saying, keep expanding, don't worry, it's not a problem. And now are kind of saying, oh, by the way, you shouldn't be polluting, and it's a problem because the EU has said so, or because we've said so. So there's been really mixed messages and really mixed incentives for farmers. And somebody in the chat mentioned, or in the Q&A mentioned, the need for support. And interestingly, recently, like there's been, people like myself have said for quite a while that the CAP, and lots of others, the Common Agricultural Policy, should be reoriented to support farmers. And of course, farm lobby groups have opposed that. They want the CAP to be as it is. And if you want us to do other environmental things, we should get more money. And interestingly, the environmental pillar, the national NGOs that Bob was mentioning earlier, they have now come out, particularly in the context of the nature restoration law, saying, yes, indeed, farmers should get more money. There needs to be more money to support farmers make the transition. So environmental NGOs are increasingly vocal on wanting farmers to get support, but to change their practices and to diversify and to cut pollution. And it is going to be inconvenient and disruptive for all of us. And obviously, as you know, although the media loves the farmer debate, it's equally challenging in transport and in housing and insulation and retrofitting and fossil fuel boilers and electricity and rolling out renewables. So it isn't just like, as we go through the next 5 to 10 years, there'll be plenty of policies that are awkward for people, and it'll be all the more important for those of us who are campaigning for action to find ways to be empathetic and inclusive, while also being firm about the need for action. And just transition isn't a veto on action. A just transition is a fair and fast transition, fast enough to prevent climate breakdown and fair enough to leave no one behind. But it isn't a veto on action. And that's not going to be a popular message, because lots of people don't want the inconvenience of change. But we know that the alternative is, worse. Aaron, do you want to point us towards questions we should answer? I know actually, for example, Sai, there was one about other examples of good housing developments. I don't know if you saw that one. I'm saying that because this is me trying to get out of trying to answer them myself, because I don't know the answer.
I was about to bring that one in, yeah. I think, Sai, you answered it already, but maybe just for the benefit of people live, because it's a good question. It was from Joe. On housing developments which provide a net gain to biodiversity, do you have good examples of recent new developments where this has been done well?
Joe, I wrote this in the reply there, but perhaps others didn't see it. But I actually don't, and I think it's definitely something we'll come back to. So we've produced 2 briefings, one on Space for Nature and one on the connected communities. But the plan is we'll not just be having the monthly meetings, to kind of be a resource to groups that are campaigning, but also we would hope to invite in some speakers from time to time to talk about specific projects or specific initiatives that would help local groups, give us a model. And so it's something that I think we should come back to, because absolutely it's critical that we have those excellent designs. I haven't seen them personally around where I live, but I haven't looked at all the local authorities planning applications or anything like that. So a bit more research to do. Thanks for the question, because it's an important one.
Just before I go into any more questions, I just want to kind of give a shout out to all of the people who are commenting around what they're already doing as part of their local groups, or what their activism already is happening. So people have mentioned that they're involved in community gardens and allotments. People have mentioned that they are involved in Dunleary Rathdown One Future, which is doing a submission on the local climate action plan. And people here have also mentioned that they're involved in Shankill for Green Earth, and County Carlow Environmental Network. So again, there's all of these pockets of activity that are happening around the country, and everyone that cares a lot about these issues and wants to do things on them. But I think it's important that we can bring these people together so that we can kind of share our resources a bit better, share our experiences a bit better, and kind of communicate and organize more effectively, because there's such a wealth of experience and motivation out there that we should really try and tap into it. But maybe, is there any other questions there that we want to jump
There was
out
one
at?
from Kate, Aaron, that about, I
Yes.
think if I understood it correctly, was about tools for holding local authorities to account. I'm going to give it a go, Si, but you might read it, see if you have anything to add, because the main thing that I have to say about that is that I don't know. Well, I think the main thing is the climate law. So, as I think has been mentioned, all the local authorities have to produce a climate action plan, a local climate action plan, by end of February, start of March next year, under the climate law. And they have to act, I don't know if this is the precise language, but they are obliged to act in a manner consistent with the climate law and in line with the overall carbon budgets, which are limits on, adopted by the DOIL, limits on pollution. So, like, it's maybe not very precise as to when, as to like an easy mechanism. Like, there's not an ombudsman we go to say, this council hasn't done enough of X or Y on retrofitting or whatever. But in our interactions with the council as citizens and as campaigners, either individually or collectively, we can, be waving the climate law at them and saying, whatever policy it is, whether it's about the local transport or space for nature or data centers or anything else, they're planning more generally, that if they aren't taking action in a way that's consistent with reducing emissions in half by 2050, well, then whether they're in breach of the climate law legally might be difficult to know easily, and may or may not be something that they can be taken to court on eventually. But it's still a stick to beat them with, for example, from a campaigning perspective, as in that is the benchmark against which they have to be measured. SIVE may have, and we will of course have local elections next year, where we'll all have a chance to interact with the candidates who are going forward and who will have a role in guiding local authorities. And as we know, local councillors aren't as powerful as they are in other countries, or as they should be probably, but there will be, they do have a role to play, an influence to play on the county managers or the CEOs. Si, you know the text of the climate law better than me, and you certainly know the like more local levers and from the rest of the local government architecture. Are there other things, if you see Kate's question, are there other tools that people can be using to hold local authorities to account?
It's a very good question, and it's a tricky one, because local authorities are set up in such a way that the executive have a lot of power and they're obliged to do what central government tells them to do. They get ministerial directives and so on and so forth, and they often have to have their initiatives kind of rubber stamped by councillors, but it's very hard for councillors to have a really big impact. Having said that, they do listen to the members, and the members do have a certain role in shaping the thinking of the non-elected, the executive officials. when we were discussing our campaign strategy, we discussed this at length actually, and we realized that it was really important to find ways to influence the executive. So when you're thinking about local authorities, it's really important to think about communicating to councillors, but that isn't enough. It's necessary but not sufficient. So you'd need to know the names and the email addresses really of the directors of service for the key areas, housing, transport, traffic and engineering and all of that. They're set up slightly differently in different local authorities. And to be able to communicate directly with them and make sure that you're, if you can get a chance to meet them and the other officials, especially the ones in the climate action unit. But the big decisions are made by the chief executive and the directors of service. So influencing them is really important. The climate law requires the local authority climate action plans to be consistent with the national climate action plan, but it's very hard for local authorities to know exactly what share of the targets and the carbon budget is allocated to them. So they're operating in a much more vague space, unfortunately. They have to produce plans for decarbonisation zones, which I personally think is entirely inadequate, but these are supposed to be showcasing, climate action in specific localities. So it'd be worth finding out what your local authority is proposing to do for those decarbonisation zones. And then just in relation to the local elections, there'll be a lot of leaflets coming through your doors over the next few months. There'll be a lot of opportunities to engage with candidates. But if you really want to have an impact on the whole election outcome and not just individual candidates who may or may not have any chance of getting elected, you really want to present yourself as a group that has a lot of local, popular support behind it, petitions, making sure that you're in touch regularly, not just one-off, but like once a month, communicating regularly, host webinars, host meetings, and invite the candidates to come along. There's loads of things that we'll probably end up discussing as the elections approach. We'll be looking at different campaigning tactics and tools that you can use to shape the public debate. But I think the most important one is engaging with the councillors as they are now, the executive in the councils, but also the local media. The local media always have loads of slots. They're delighted to have people on to talk about issues, and getting your voice heard on the local radio and in the local print media can be very effective.
Okay. I think we're going to have to kind of get to the end of this part of the webinar now. There's such a wide kind of variety of questions and so many. It's really great to see the enthusiasm. I think unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to everything and every comment, but hopefully, this is the start of a discussion and the start of a campaign and the start of future activity, not the end. There's one there that maybe, I think I see Oisin, you're responding to it now, but maybe this is one that's worth addressing to kind of finish up, which is, can we ask local councils to commit to divesting any funds held by the council from fossil fuel investments? Is that another thing we could do locally?
So aside from maybe answer this too, I was going to say we can, but my guess is that Irish local councils don't have any significant investments. The way they're funded and the way they get their money, like any pensions or whatever, would be all provided by central government, which has divested its sovereign wealth fund. And of course, even for the pensions, well, they're doing a new fund now, but we don't pay. The Irish government doesn't have a pension fund; it just pays pensioners today out of current taxes. So pretty much. So I don't think, Si, there is a divestment angle really on local councils.
No, but perhaps there's a local business angle. Perhaps there's a significant business in your local community that could be targeted for a bit of campaigning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think between all of this, we're going to have follow-up sessions and the materials that are going out. Hopefully this can be further explored and teased out and worked into, local campaigns as we go, because there's a million and one ways that we could take this, and it's great to see all the different kinds of questions. But yeah, I think further kind of discussion and planning is kind of the next step. So that brings me on to the last bit as to what are we actually saying is the next steps. How do you go out and act local? So now is the time to take the resources and get active in your local community. So first things first, if you could sign up for the Act Local campaign. So these are the links I shared in the chat earlier, and that will also be going to your email after you registered for this session. So this is just to sign up for the mailing list and to register your interest as getting involved as a group or as an individual who's looking to join or form a group. We just need that information so we can get a map as to who's already, organized and who needs a bit of help getting that first stage, getting those other people together to have something to get off the ground. Next, we are going to have our first drop-in session for planning our campaigns and for mutual support and advice on the 26th of October. This is going to be followed by another one on the 16th of November and then again on the 7th of December. For these, we're planning on, yes, getting people in the room together. It's going to be a bit more interactive, a bit more facilitated. So it's not going to be a panel. It's going to be more of a meeting. And also we are thinking about bringing in potential guest speakers of those who have carried out successful campaigns in the recent past, or, people that we can learn from who are sort of like trailblazers on these issues. So just for one more moment of your participation, I'm going to set up a poll. And this is just which time would you prefer in general for these check-in meetings? It's multiple choice, so if you can do either time generally, fill in both. And we're going to aim to get times that suit the majority of people insofar as possible. So just take 1 minute and fill that out if you don't mind. Okay, I think that's nearly everyone who's filled it out. It's been up for a minute. And I think I'm not seeing many more people answering it, so we'll end that poll. So there's the results. It's about, it's about 2/3. Well, it's actually much more than, well, yeah, it's about 2/3. About 1/3 that can do a lunchtime and about 80% that can do evenings. So we'll take that in mind for when we schedule the sessions. The exact time I will send out, or we will send out from Friends of the Earth for the first session. And we may hold maybe one of the sessions at a lunchtime just to suit the most amount of people, in case some people can't make the evenings. But thanks for that. That's really useful information for where we go from here. And so if there's any questions, queries, or follow-up, you can contact me, Aaron at fo.ie. So I'm part of the Movement Building Circle with Emma Jane here today. So we're going to be focusing on the practicalities of getting people organized, getting people into groups, and getting people to take those sort of first steps and actions out in the world. So if you have anything along those lines, ways you want to get involved, want to be put in contact with other people, not sure where to start, please feel free to contact me and we can go from there. And yeah, also, if there's other policy questions, I'll direct them to Sive or Oisín, or maybe people who can answer a little bit better than me. But yeah, let's go forward, and hopefully we can meet on the 26th of October and plan the first steps for our local campaigns together and act locally for faster and fair climate action and put pressure on decision makers to abide by that. So been really good to see everybody. And yes, last thing I will share is the link to the resources. I will just put it in the chat here. Thank you, Emma Jane. So this is the resources. So they're all on the website, and that's where you can also sign up to the campaign to get on the mailing list, to hear further updates and get invites to further events. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you had a good evening. I hope you feel inspired, energized to get out and take action. And hopefully I'll see you all again soon. Okay. Thank you, folks.